Russia will be held accountable if it invades. And it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia. My guess is he will move in. He has to do something.
Ukrainian officials reacted with shock with what President Biden said when he talked about a minor incursion might be a different situation. CNN reporter Matthew Chance is on the ground in Kyiv. And Matthew, it's been so interesting to hear from you in real time, the Ukrainian reaction.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Look, I mean, as soon as President Biden made that distinction between a minor incursion and a full invasion and suggested that a minor action by the Russian military, an incursion into Ukraine, would elicit a lesser response in terms of sanctions than a full invasion. I mean, my telephone just lit up with people texting me, Ukrainian officials saying, they were shocked and stunned by what they heard. Usually, remember, US officials talk about the crushing sanctions that will be imposed against Russia if there's any kind of military action at all. This nuance, this sliding scale of, lesser sanctions for a lesser incursion, it's just never been made public before, even though I understand that behind closed doors in the United States, that's always been something that has been considered. It's certainly not been something that they've put out there publicly. And, the big concern expressed by one Ukrainian official I spoke to last night is that this offers Vladimir Putin a green light, in his words, to enter Ukraine at his pleasure, I think was the phrase that he used. And of course, remember, a limited incursion in Ukraine's east, possibly expanding the rebel-controlled zone or possibly seizing some kind of land corridor that connects, the rebel zone with Crimea, if you're familiar with the geography at all, is many analysts feel that that's Vladimir Putin's preferred option. So the idea that he could do that and only elicit limited sanctions from the United States instead of the devastating ones that have been promised is something Ukrainian officials feel may actually encourage the Kremlin sort of to press the go button. John.
Matthew Chance for us in Kyiv. Matthew, please keep your ear to the ground. Let us know what else you hear this morning. Obviously, you're in one of the most important positions in the world right now, so we appreciate it.
Very much so. All right, joining us now, Washington Bureau Chief of the USA Today, Susan Page, and CNN political and national security analyst and White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger, who, of course, we saw question the president yesterday at the news conference. And David, let me start with you on that very point, because as we just heard from Matthew Chance, this was not received well in Kyiv. I was very surprised when the president said what he said about potentially having a minor incursion here, acknowledging that an invasion may be all but inevitable, and talking about the fact that NATO may not be united in response if that incursion was minor. What's your analysis around what we saw yesterday and how it's going to impact the standoff on the border?
Well, Casey, I was surprised that he said it in public, but what's the old line that a gaffe in Washington is saying something that's true in public, right?
Fair.
And I think that's what went on here. NATO is not completely unified on these issues. They're unified about what happens if Russia moves to seize all of Ukraine back. As Matthew suggested before, there are not many people who think that that is Putin's preferred way of doing this, because he knows that that will result in an insurgency and he'll be stuck there as the Soviet Union was stuck in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So the most likely it would be that he would take some of the Russian-speaking areas around Crimea, and the president clearly, has been briefed on that and was probably talking about it a little more honestly than he should. I think the fact that he said this now probably means that the United States and its allies will have to go react more strongly, even if there is a minor incursion. And we won't know if one starts, whether it's minor or major, for some time.
That's really interesting that perhaps this actually created a situation where the response needs to be even stronger. Susan, a gaffe is the truth said out loud, but diplomacy and national security does require precision of language. And when you telegraph that NATO is not united, when NATO unity is actually the main thing that needs to be projected to Vladimir Putin, how much of a problem does that create?
Yeah, and later in the news conference, in reference to a different topic, the president said he needed to act more like the president and not like a senator. And here was a case where he was acting, I think, like a senator. A senator could have taken that question and given that answer, and we would have quoted it, and it would have been fine. But a president does not have that luxury because every word is parsed. Everyone around the world is listening to it and taking cues from it. And one thing I think is damaging for President Biden in terms of this answer is one of the promises he made to Americans when he was elected a year ago was competence and experience in his administration, including in foreign policy. And I think this risks raising questions once again about the competence of his administration, as did the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah, one of the other things, David, that I think has dogged President Biden is a perception perhaps of weakness. I've spoken to Democrats who are worried that he potentially appears weak. Do you think that that's what we saw yesterday? If you're Vladimir Putin watching that news conference, did President Biden project weakness to the Russian president?
Well, I think that Putin pretty well understood what the range of options are and how they may split NATO. And so to the degree that he got confirmation of his view that there are splits in NATO, then perhaps so. But I thought that overall, the president, in his response, was actually pushing back on Putin pretty hard. I mean, it was interesting to see where he took this question. I asked him about whether or not Putin wanted to have a Cold War resumption, and he answered by saying, well, I don't think that he wants to go back into a full-scale war. And then proceeded to describe where Putin was sort of jammed in between the West and China. And in some ways, he almost described Putin as a somewhat weak figure who's making quick tactical decisions rather than big strategic ones. And I think that was an effort by the president not to declare that Putin was 10 feet tall. But the speed at which the White House had to go clean up the comments on a minor incursion versus a major one, I think shows you that they were concerned that the terminology would make the president seem weak or give Putin a pretext.
And look, I think that might be what stings the White House the most, Susan, is that the president clearly does have a comprehension of that region. He has an eagerness to talk about that region. He knows what he wants there. He knows what he's doing. And you got the impression at his first summit with Vladimir Putin that Putin got it too, that there was a tacit understanding between these two men about a tougher stance in some ways toward Russia than maybe before, which is why I think the idea of a cleanup on something like this stings internationally, but also, as Casey said, stings domestically. The last thing that this White House wants is the image that people have to clean up after this president.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, this is one of the reasons I think that the White House has had so few of these big formal news conferences at the White House. This has just been the second one of his presidency. I mean, kudos to the president for standing up there for nearly 2 hours and taking questions
Indeed.
from all comers, including from reporters that he knew were going to ask him very critical questions. So let's not forget that he did that. But the risk of doing that is that there's some things you leave that you're going to have to clean up.